Hello everyone! Today I'm going to be showing you how to sew the cabin shorties. So I'm going to be sewing the ones that have the mock fly opening. So it's meant to look kind of like a menswear style brief, but they're nice little short shorts for women. They're perfect for underneath skirts or for nightwear or for anything really. I pretty much wear these all the time whenever I get an opportunity. So I'll be walking you through this today. There are lots of different ways to finish these. So this is just one of the ways that I like to finish them. If you have any questions or comments, be sure to leave them in the comments and I will do my best to respond to you. Anyways, let's get sewing. Because I'm going to be making the mock fly variation of the cabin shorties, I have cut two of the front pieces, and I've also cut a small piece of interfacing and adhered it to the wrong side of the left side of the panties front. So basically that's going to be where just a little bit of stabilization for our mock fly if you want to do a buttonhole or something like that. I have made plenty of these with no interfacing. Because it's not a functional fly, you don't have to add this here. At least in my experience, I have found that you don't have to. But if you plan on putting in a buttonhole or something like that, it is probably a good idea to do a little bit of interfacing right there. So I've got my pieces cut out and I'm going to begin by assembling the front. So I've got that one piece with the interfacing adhered to it, and I'm going to layer my opposite piece over top, and I'm going to begin by making a small mark about a ½ inch in from where the bottom of my fly stops and about a ½ inch up. So you can measure this out or you can use the mark that's on the pattern piece itself. This is going to be a start and stop stitching line as well as a notching line. So when I assemble the front of these, I usually use my sewing machine to basically baste it all together, and then I go over my seams with a serger. And I would recommend doing that for this style. So I am sewing with a ½ inch seam allowance. I'm basically going to sew all the way up to where I made that small dot in the previous step. So stop right on your dot with the needle down, lift your foot, you're going to pivot your fabric around, and then you're going to continue along that curved edge of the mock fly. A little back tack at the top. From here, we're going to need to take a sharp pair of scissors and basically do a slash from where the fly begins to curve right up to where we stopped and pivoted our stitching line. And that's basically going to let that open a little bit. The next thing we're going to do is I'm going to just baste along the center front seam to where we did that pivot point. These stitches will get removed in a later step, so make sure you use a nice long stitch. Now that that's basically assembled, I'm going to take it through my serger and I'm going to serge around the curved fly. I'm going to kind of open it up and continue down. So now you can see I've serged all the way up along my center front seam and around my mock fly. And now we can open it up. And basically it just looks like we've got a front seam in it, or a center front seam. But the next step is going to either use a cover stitch or a twin needle or just any stitch on your sewing machine. And you're essentially going to do a decorative stitch that anchors this mock fly down. So you're going to be stitching around this curve and doing a back tack or some kind of securing stitch once you get back to the center front seam. So I've run 2 lines of decorative stitching around my mock fly to highlight that area. So now we've basically done the complicated part, and the rest, if you've made underwear before, is going to be a lot of repetition. If it's your first time, I promise it's not that scary. Now that we've got our mock fly completed, it's time to move on to the gusset, which it can be difficult to wrap your head around if you've never sewn a gusset before, but it actually is quite easy once you get the hang of it. So we've got 2 parts to our gusset. We have a lining and we have the exterior fabric. So I'm starting on my front, and with the right sides facing each other, you basically line up the front of your gusset to the front of your crotch seam, and then you take your lining, and with the right side facing the wrong side of the panties, you basically sandwich that panties piece in between these 2 layers, and then you're going to stitch that together with your sewing machine or your serger. So if you've never done this before, or if you're working with a slippery fabric, I would recommend pinning this, or you could even just baste together your self pieces first before adding your lining. But because I've done this 1,000 million times, I'm just going to go ahead and line this up and run it through my serger. So once you have that seam stitched, what you basically get is your seam, your crotch seam, encased between your exterior layer and your gusset, which makes a really nice finish. So now what we're going to do is we're going to flip back our lining and flip forward our gusset. You might notice here I usually make a notch at the center back point of my pieces. It just helps me make sure that I know which way is front and which way is back. So at this point we're going to roll forward our front piece. So you can see here we've got our lining on one side and our self piece on the other side. Both are facing right side up. Take your back piece and kind of drape it over, line it up with your gusset self, right sides facing. And you can choose to baste that here or pin that. And then you're going to take your gusset and flip it up and over and stitch that together. So now we've sewn both the front and the back gusset seams, and we get to flip it right side out. So just flip it all through that side opening. There, and you can see this is really nicely encased. It's a nice, almost seamless finish on the inside and the outside. So from here, we can flip it around and line up one side seam. So it doesn't really matter which one you use, which one you do first, but we're just going to stitch one closed. So again, using either your sewing machine or serger, we're just going to attach that together. Now that I've completed my first side seam, I'm ready to move on to the elastic stage. So in this instance, I'm actually going to use a 1/2 inch band elastic to complete my upper edge of my waistband. You could use like a decorative lingerie elastic, you could use a fold over elastic, you could even use just a regular elastic, though the method might be slightly different. So in this case, I'm using an elastic that has a decorative edge and a plain edge, and I want my decorative edge to just peek out over the top edge of my waistband. So working from the right side of my garment and starting at the open side of my side seam, this is where I'm going to start sewing my elastic. Now I'm ready to sew the elastic around the upper edge of my panties. So I'm starting at that open side seam, and I have my elastic, which in this case is a 1/2 inch band elastic, placed onto the right side of my garment, and I have the decorative edge, this little looped edge, pointing down towards the hemline. So I'm using a zigzag stitch to do the first row of stitching onto my elastic. So just do a couple stitches to anchor it on. And then I like to use a stretch and sew method. I prefer this method over sewing it in a loop because I find it to be a little quicker. This is the way I've been doing it for the last 10 years of lingerie making, and it's just the method I prefer. No one method is right, no one method is wrong. Do whatever way you prefer and which one gets you the finished look that you like. If you're sewing the variation that has the mock fly, just make sure that it doesn't gape open as you're sewing the elastic over that center front area. So from here, I flip my garment around and I like to just trim back any excess fabric that extends too far beyond my stitching line. You want it so that when you turn the elastic under, you don't have any raw edges peeking through. If you are a more precise sewer than I am, you might be able to completely skip this step. So if you were finishing the upper edge with a fold over elastic, I would recommend at this point you would fold the elastic over and then stitch it down with a zigzag stitch or with your cover stitch machine and then finish your side seam. But if you're using a decorative elastic or a band elastic like I've used, I would recommend that you do the side seam at this point. So lining up the upper edge of your elastics, I like to kind of just baste that together with my sewing machine before I run it through my serger to close that final open side seam. So at this point, you basically have a pair of underwear. It's just a matter of doing the final finishing touches now, the hems and finishing up your elastic. So at this point, if it's your first time making this pattern, it's a great time to try them on and just see if you need to make any small adjustments. So for instance, if you're finding them slightly too loose, you could just quickly kind of take them in slightly through the side seam, or you could tighten your elastic or do little changes like that. For myself, I'm ready to go ahead and finish off my waistband. So I've sewn my final side seam and I'm going to turn my elastic under towards the inside of my garment so that my little decorative edge is just peeking out over the top. And I like to use a multi-step zigzag stitch, but you could easily use a twin needle, a cover stitch, just a regular zigzag stitch, any stitch that's going to give you a lot of stretch. I finished top stitching the waist elastic with the multi-step zigzag stitch, and now we are almost done. So the final stage to finishing these is just to simply turn the leg opening under. So you can either finish this raw edge with your serger and then turn it under using a zigzag stitch to top stitch it in place. You could use a twin needle on your regular sewing machine, or if you have a cover stitch machine, this is a great place to use that to finish off these leg openings. These leg openings do not need any kind of elastic reinforcement because they're meant to fit like a fitted short or like a boxer style short. And that's it. So I'm gonna go ahead and send this through my cover stitch machine to finish up these edges. And I also am gonna sew a small button onto the front just as a decorative finishing piece. So I'm gonna sew the button through all of my layers just with a needle and thread. So here's our completed garment. I've finished my hemline with my cover stitch machine, but you can use any stretch stitch. You just want to make sure that it's something that is going to provide a lot of stretch to this opening. And I've sewn 2 decorative buttons to my mock fly. So they have been sewn through all of the layers. And again, this is just purely decorative. Anyways, that's it. They're a fairly simple sew and a fairly quick sew, but I find this to be a really versatile piece. So I hope you enjoy sewing this with me, and let me know if you have any questions or comments. Bye.